So, as I ask, these are the situations that have created urgency, for us. As we go through these webinars, and I've talked about this topic in the past, I like to ask, which one of these, either for an existing project or one that you're just getting started, have you experienced has been enough of a theme and enough of an urgency to get a project started? So I think that's going to be our first polling question, which is, of the following situations listed here, have you experienced any of them to get a project started? And I think there's also an option for other as well. So Avi, I'm not going to get to see it when the polling questions start.
You'll see the results, Brian.
Okay.
I'll display them in about 10 seconds.
Okay. Okay. So also, in general, if there's any questions as they come through, you can send them to Avi, and if it's particularly pertinent, or if there's a couple questions that come in on the same topic, Avi can interrupt, and we can talk through it before we go on to the next section. But to keep in mind, that's the first step, is creating the urgency. Once you have that theme, once you can answer the question, why are we doing this, to somebody who doesn't care about DITA or technical publication, we're selling our first product to China, we have to translate it. The industry is pushing to handheld devices. We need some way of reusing our content across our website, our printed publications, and these Android devices that have been part of our marketing strategy. At that point, once you have that theme, at that point you can dive into justifying the opportunity. And we've changed this over the years. It used to be identifying opportunities, but it really starts you off in the wrong direction. You have to be able to find the overwhelming theme, why this matters to your company as a whole, why is it so important, and then justify it with the ROI calculations. And so, these obvious ones that you look at, and there's webinars created, there's lots of literatures on how to do this, but there's a few things that I want to point out. There's two sides of the business opportunity, the business justification. Technical writers, IT people, systems integrators tend to focus on the reduction of the cost. And these are things like streamlining internal publishing costs, automating publishing tasks, streamlining editorial processes, reducing content errors, also reducing long-term support costs. And those are a little bit easier to get your hands on because you have a sense of what you're spending on it. However, you can't ignore the other side of business opportunities, which oftentimes are much more impactful when you're trying to come up with an overall business justification for getting a DITA project started. And these are things that affect revenue: faster time to market, premium support revenue, new informational products, document derivative products, and new distribution channels. And the faster time to market, this comes up a lot for pharmaceutical companies, but it applies to any company. But I'll use the example for pharmaceutical. I think everyone understands when a new product comes out, it is a brand name product. Companies can charge a huge premium. There's lots of discussions to degree of which that's appropriate until the patent wears out. Then it becomes a generic drug. So there's a window in place. But what happens is the drug's available to be sold, and then the product documentation, the product insert, the labeling information, all that has to be approved by the FDA before they can actually sell it. So the shorter the time to create that product documentation can be linked to the billions of dollars of revenue. Even if you just save 1 or 2 weeks or 1 or 2 months, that allows it to be sold more at a brand name price, that's enough to justify a XML-based publishing system, 10 times over. And the reason why I bring this up is sometimes that's enough. Who cares if there's some internal cost savings? Because oftentimes this will dwarf in terms of financial benefits if you can tie this to new revenue. Sometimes, especially if you're let's go to the premium support. Sometimes embedded technical information, online information on demand, customized information for your product configuration, people are willing to pay more for. So, again, ultimately what comes down to this is a ROI calculation. People want to know a number. What's the return on the investment we're having for our project? And, again, there's lots of discussions on this. I just want to bring up to make sure everyone understands what actually that calculation is. And there's 2 areas that I want to point out that often get people in trouble. The official definition of return on investment is you have the business benefit subtract by the cost of the investment divided by the cost of investment, right there. As you come up with this calculation, make sure you really, really focus on 2 areas. One is, how do you calculate the actual business benefit? One way, if you go to your accountant or someone from finance, they're not going to have any. Chances are they're not going to give you any guidance. But one general way to start, if you don't really understand how to do this, would be just come up with agreed upon cost of your operations. And then you'd come up with a general assumption the cost of producing your output is directly proportional to the amount of output that you have if you're not using a DITA-based system. And then you multiply that by the reuse factor. So if you have 10 documents out there that cost $100 to produce in general, and it turns out that 50% reuse, you could update and edit and review and publish just 5 units instead of 10 units to create that same output, you would save 50%. And the second is you have to multiply it by a success factor. So even if theoretically you think the return on investment, you come up with a number of 50%, at best, you're going to achieve 80% of your goals. And it becomes much more complicated than that. But in general, I wouldn't want, and one of the main points from the creating the urgency, don't use this and prance around and think that this number is going to mean anything to anyone. You can't identify an opportunity with this ROI. Use it to justify a business theme that people understand. And don't make it too complicated. Make sure that the business benefit calculation people will get, and then just to make it conservative, multiply its success factor. As you can imagine, these can be much more complicated. And I'll show you, very quickly an example of some that have been put together in the past. And this is available as a starting point. I mean, we give these away just for anyone who asks, because again, it's valuable to justify some other things going on. You're not going to be able to get a project started just based on this calculation. As we put together these ROIs, it's the primary publication type. It's a little bit different based on the industry. And then, we force people to look at the ROI drivers as well. Typical parameters, it's pretty much understood what the costs are going to be to compose pages, to convert pages, CMS costs, XML authoring costs, and then your inputs. You can imagine the more pages you have, the more authors you have, the more different outputs you have, the greater the cost savings are going to be. And I'm not going to go through this one by one, because the point of this discussion is this is a necessary piece, but it's by definition secondary. You have to get the urgency there in place. And either by asking Avi or sending an email to me, we can send out a copy of this to whoever's interested. But you can see it can get pretty involved in the ROI calculations. All of those have been pretty well established, and it's nothing more than 7th, 8th grade arithmetic to come up with it. When you look at this, though, some typical problems that people have with our ROIs, what we'll get to in a little bit, but as soon as you throw out numbers like this, people that aren't experts in technical publications, aren't experts in IT, they're really going to start picking this apart. So we'll talk a little bit about this in the next session. So at this point, most of your work is done. If you can have a theme in place that people understand, you have the justification of the opportunity in terms of ROI calculation, then the next step before you start building anything is anticipating where you're going to get resistance from. And you are going to get resistance from the budget standpoint, the IT standards, the end users, and also executive support. We've already adjusted the executive managers because you can address the overall urgency when it comes up. But from the budget perspective, a couple things that are worth noting is in these calculations before, we said there's 50% return on investment over a 2-year period. Sometimes they don't care about 2 years. They want projects that return in 6 months. We talked about generating cost savings and revenue generation, as well as not factoring in the risk of success. A couple things that are going to come up that you should expect is how you allocate your costs. Does it matter if you calculate internal resources for server costs, for travel? And then the other aspect of this is just because there's 50% productivity increase doesn't necessarily mean that it equates to cost savings. So we've seen this before where there's 50% productivity gain, but there's 5 technical writers there. There's still going to be 5 technical writers, so unless you reduce them to 2.5, you're not going to see that. From an IT standard perspective, after you have the urgency in place, after you have the business justification from an ROI perspective, you can anticipate that there'll be resistance also from the IT group. The big one has to do with why use DITA, or why use XML. And in this one, all I could say is be flexible. If you have your heart set on a CMS that's built from the ground up to use DITA, but there's a corporate-wide initiative and agreement to use SharePoint, even from a XML editing perspective, if you love XML, but they have to stick with Frame, you can't jeopardize the overall success of a project just because of one standard or another. This technology has been around for a while. We're choosing DITA, not choosing DITA, choosing one CMS, choosing one publishing output doesn't really affect the overall success or failure of the project. So the only thing here, even if you have your heart set on DITA, you have your heart set on a particular outside company to help you, an outside CMS or even editor, this is the one area that you should be flexible on. And the last point before we talk about the driving action to close up is make sure that everyone understands what you're actually delivering. What we said at the beginning, this is what we put together. We put together a system that enforces structured writing using DITA so that information can be reused across formatting documentation. Some companies don't buy systems. They don't want a new system. They want to invest in a new process. Sometimes they want to invest in their content, so they want a content conversion project. Sometimes they want to invest just in an editor. Sometimes it's a publishing output. So it's pretty important that don't call this a system implementation where nobody's interested in a new system in your organization. It might have to be a data conversion project, or it might have to be labeled a new XML editing system. And then also come up with the right name. This whole concept was DITA CMS, XML authoring, single source publishing. There's different implementations. Make sure that you use the terminology that makes sense, not of the technology that you're purchasing, but for the technology internal that makes sense to them. And the last piece is make sure that when you demonstrate this, this is an example of what XML looks like using DITA, their integration with Documentum. It's a great vision of what this system looks like, but nobody outside of IT, no one outside of tech pubs really cares about a system that looks like this. Time and time again, as a company, we spent weeks, sometimes months, converting data, configuring an editor, putting in a CMS, developing output, and we demonstrate the tools behind the scenes. People aren't interested in the tools behind the scenes. They want to see the output. They want to see that in this situation for one of our customers, that this under home on their website is generated from a DITA map, or that this content that's used in their Flash application for getting people to buy these new Gulf streams comes from an XML source. So make sure that after you have the urgency and you're flexible with the IT standards, that you have the right context for your ROI, that you put in place some visual picture of what this project's going to be. And it should be the end result, not the tools behind the scenes. And this was stated to me, if you're building this huge mansion for someone on a hill, they come up, they want to see a vision of what it's going to look like. This would be like showing them the shovels and the bulldozers that's used to create it, not a picture of what it's going to look like in the future. So the last step, and this is where companies like Dakota and Just Systems help all the time, putting together a proof of concept, coming up with the action plan, coming up with a cost, going through training. We're more than happy to help people with that, but we're very skeptical if you haven't done the work of identifying why this project is important. Then you justify the opportunity with some budgetary numbers. You've identified, and there are going to be pockets of resistance out there, and then you can start a proof of concept. And if there's no official budget given to you, there's no official sanction, you can see that if you really care and it really makes sense to do this, there's plenty of work that you can do in creating the urgency, identifying the resistance, looking at justifying the opportunity, and even going through the proof of concept without any official sanction or any official budget granted to you. So if you get to the point where you have the 3 preliminary steps in place, what you have to do is realize that if it makes sense to put this in place, and instinctually you know that your environment could be improved with a database publishing system, you should work on getting something started. And the purpose of this demonstration is to hopefully give you some ideas of things that you can work on in this concept phase with really no budget. And then also, if the time horizon is too long and it really looks like nothing's going to happen in the short term, focus on getting something in as a phased approach. And so, just in summary, I said there were two or three slides that are really worth committing to memory. This last one is the second, where you can almost tell as you talk to somebody about their projects. You don't ask them what their justification statement is, but ask them, why are you doing this? And listen to their answer. And if it's more than 15 seconds long, chances are that project's not going to do very well. They should be able to answer, well, what's the return on the investment? And you shouldn't come up with that big spreadsheet thinking that it's going to create the urgency that's needed, but there should be some areas where you're going to increase costs, and again, or decrease costs, and it should be one or two sentences. You should identify where the IT resistance is going to be, what the landscape is internally. What are you calling your project? Is it a system? Is it content conversion? Is it XML editing? Is it a process change? You should have a visualization approach, whether it's a proof of concept, screenshot. It could be, really even sometimes be an architectural diagram. And then you should always be prepared. If you do your work in the steps preceding, be prepared for someone that's, this is a great idea, let's start. How do we begin? And you should have a plan to implement it with some general schedule and some general costs in place. And a lot of this can be done without any official blessing from your company. So, at this point, covered just the tip of the iceberg. There's hours and hours that can be discussed on the implementation details of this, but just remember, in two respects, we came up with this title that no budget, no problem. Superficially, you look at it, just because you don't have an official sanction, official budget, it doesn't matter. You can still get a lot done. But more importantly, as we got to the end of this, if there's no budget, that means that there's no problem. And it's your job to find that problem that warrants the urgency to get something started. So if there isn't budget to do something yet, it's your job to find the problem that has to be solved. Sometimes it's just repositioning. Sometimes it involves a little bit more investigation. So at this point, just with a few more minutes, if there's any questions that have come in, any questions that are needed to be addressed, we have a couple minutes to go through them. As Avi mentioned, copies of this webinar, I think recording will be available. I can certainly make the slides available to anyone. And that spreadsheet, you can send me an email or send Avi an email. We'd be able to get to any questions that aren't answered here, or if you need a copy of that spreadsheet.
Hey, Brian, I sent you one question if you open up the chat, and then there's another one in the Q&A section as well, if you want to open those up.
So from, I guess it's Janice, are there any templates available that we can use? The justification statement, ROI, or sample plan for implementation. The latter two, yes. The ROI spreadsheet that I brought up certainly is available. The important thing, though, is that don't rely too heavily on that. You can get caught up in all these assumptions and coming up with this return on investment calculation. I think it's a required step to justify your idea, but the important thing is there a template for the justification statement? And it's definitely no. It's your job to come up with the terminology that really makes sense. And if it sounds like a justification statement, it's probably not going to be effective. Think of somebody who doesn't work with you, who's in another industry, and say, well, why do you need this DITA-based system? And you should be able to explain that. And that's much more powerful than any type of official justification statement or mission statement that sounds, and the short answer, there are templates available, but they often sound a little bit too lofty and contrived to be effective.
I'm going to cut you off there, Brian. That's all we have time for today. That ends our webinar. Thank you again, Brian, for your willingness to share information and experiences. Also, thank you for everyone attending. We're glad you could join us and hope the session was helpful. Just as a reminder, I will send out the link to the recording after, as well as so you can view it and share it with colleagues or anyone else who might be interested. Please know that we're available for any additional questions after the webinar. You can email Brian or myself at any time. And thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Brian, if you could stick around for a couple minutes, please.
Yep.
Cool.
So I'll just call you directly.